just to say that this workshop should be completely open to anyone at any level. So it's completely open to anyone from absolute beginner programmers to folks with a little bit more experience or experience in other programming languages. The first thing I wanted to do before we get started is for everyone first off to please switch their cameras on, so I'm not just speaking into the void. And then maybe we'll have a brief introduction. So for those of us who are not the technical support or the events team, just having a run through, please introduce yourself. Please let me know what brings you here, what brings you to this particular workshop here at the Women in Technology Festival. And maybe just because there are only a few of us, we've got time. If you can think of something, 2020 has been a trip for everyone, as we know. If we can think of something as an icebreaker, one positive thing that has happened to you in 2020, one positive thing in 2020 so far. So for me, my name's Abby. I've been a software engineer for about 6 years. What brings me here is I love teaching and sharing functional programming with others. And one positive thing for me in 2020 is that I'm a bit of an introvert. So actually working from home has been, and seeing Zoom every day, despite the kind of Zoom fatigue. Working from home probably has been a good thing for me, and kind of getting to spend more time with my partner, because we're locked in a building together basically for much of the latter half of the year. So I'll pass on to is it Karen? Because we've spoken already, so I'll pass on to Karen to introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Karen Wilde. I'm a service manager of IT for North Yorkshire County Council. My history in coding probably goes back to the ZX Spectrums and the ZX81s. I was very young at that time, I must say, but that's where our experience of coding comes from. So just wanted to sort of see what it's like today, really, and that's why I'm here. Positives for 2020. I think for me, it has been the virtual meetings, the amount of work we seem to have got through as a business, because very quickly we've been able to meet, we've been able to make decisions and have discussions without having to find meeting rooms in County Hall and things like that. So, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Karen. Maybe Siobhan, do you want to go next? Well, let me know if I've mispronounced your name.
No, that's perfect. That's fine. Yeah, I'm Siobhan Lyons. I work for IQQ as an applications manager. And I'm interested in this today because we use sort of different languages in my current role, so some SQL and some VBA and stuff like that, but I was interested in learning about another one. Positives for 2020. Have to say it'd be my little puppy that I got to keep me company during all the lockdown, but she's not here today, which is good because you probably hear her barking constantly non-stop in the background. But yeah, work-wise, it's been a better work-life balance, I would say, in 2020, with the lack of commute, although the commute in Belfast isn't as long as in London or anything, but yeah, it has been good.
Awesome, thanks, Siobhan. Is it Gio Achina? Again, correct me if I'm mispronouncing names.
It is Joaquina, no worries. Very complicated name. So I am the technical engagement manager for Cisco Meraki Europe, and I'm currently not working with programming languages. However, I studied as a computer engineer, so I cultivated this passion as a hobby, and after I mainly focused in embedded systems, so imperative programming and functional programming is a new thing for me. A good thing of 2020 is definitely, as someone said before, the balance between work and personal life. The commute in London is terrible. So I can be grateful about that, at least.
That's great. Thank you so much. see Flannery next. If Flannery, you're around and you feel comfortable turning your video on just for intros, please feel free to do so.
Yes, apologies. I joined a few minutes late, so I missed the initial intros, but lovely to meet you all. My name is Flannery. I work for CDW UK, so I'm in the tech industry currently, but do not have experience coding, so very excited to be here today.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then I think, is it Lais? I'm just mispronouncing everyone's name today, I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi. I'm Lais. I'm a data analyst from EY. And yeah, I think the best thing for 2020 is the time that I'm able to invest in myself, learning new things. So that's mainly why I joined this course.
That's a really brilliant one. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That's such a good point. I'm not ignoring Joe McLean, but we spoke privately on Zoom chat, and I understand you're here to do technical support. So it's up to you, Joe. You're welcome to just unmute yourself and give a quick intro, but also I appreciate you might not be here. So.
No, I'm here. I'm Joe McLean. I'm working with my colleague Georgina Shaw to sort of run the event on the day. I don't have any experience in coding, but I'm looking forward to hearing about this. It all sounds really exciting. So I'll be here in the background.
Awesome, thank you, Joe. It's really lovely to meet you all. I'm actually really delighted that we've got a class of like a group of this size, because I'm really hopeful that it'll encourage a lot of discussion and questions, and it's not so like intimidatingly large a group that no one wants to say anything. So I will share my screen with you and also share a link, which is so you can see the same screen. Can you see the words Introduction to Functional Programming with Haskell on my screen? I saw a couple of nods. I'll share this link in the chat so you can also see it. This is our, so consider this our rough kind of schedule for today. So we've gone through and kind of done brief intros, and it was really nice to meet everyone and hear what you're hoping to get out of this workshop. The next thing we'll try is an interactive, a very, very short interactive kind of Haskell introduction. So you have a few exercises to complete in your browser. I should say that for the duration of this workshop, you don't have to install anything. We only have 2 hours. So to be honest, it might well take me an hour and a half to get a development environment set up for Haskell. So I wanted to avoid that. So we'll start off first off with a kind of interactive Haskell tutorial in the browser. That might take 10-15 minutes. I want to encourage questions throughout, but in particular, I want to encourage sort of discussions in between each of these things. So after the short interactive tutorial, if there's any questions or if there's anything that's really unclear, let's just like discuss that and nip it in the bud straight away. Following that, we'll start on a slightly bigger Haskell project. So this will be like a rock, paper, scissors game. This will allow us to do quite interesting things like model state, define like functions and variables, and get like a very sort of a very kind of high level understanding of a few different functional programming principles. Again, I would encourage questions throughout, and also kind of stop off and make sure that folks are happy with the way that the project is progressing. The way that I would see this working is by all means click through to the link, and the first one I would suggest doing the try Haskell thing as a group. So maybe giving ourselves 15 minutes to do all of the exercises. At the end of that 15 minutes, encourage discussion. And then for the Haskell project, we would kind of go through that at our own pace. So that's very much a like written step-by-step guide, which I encourage you to go through at your own pace and ask questions as we go. In the meantime, I'll be going through it with you as well in case of any questions, or in case anyone gets stuck or anything like that. And then we'll finish off with another kind of brief discussion, questions, any questions about like the broader software engineering or functional programming industries, or just anything other than that. After that very swift intro, are there any questions before we start on the interactive Haskell tutorial section? Cool, I'm seeing a couple of heads shaking. Also throughout, feel free to ask questions and unmute yourself, or just ask questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on both, so that's not a problem. Right, so without further ado, if everyone has you should just see a Notion document link in the chat. If you click through to that and then click on the first item in the workshop schedule, you'll come through to Try Haskell website. So this is the interactive introductory kind of Haskell 5-10 minute tutorial. So we'll give ourselves maybe till let's say 5 to 4. We'll work through some of these exercises, and then we'll stop for sort of questions and discussions afterwards. I'm going to mute myself in the meantime and just walk through this with you. Hi, good afternoon. I've just noticed someone else joining the call. Just to let you know, we've done a brief round of introductions. So first off, welcome. I'm Abby. I'll be running the workshop today. I won't put you on the spot by asking your name, but I'll just share the project page that we're starting off with. So that's the one that you can see on my screen here. I'll share this in the chat. We're working through the first link, which is an interactive Haskell tutorial online. If you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to unmute yourself or type in chat as you prefer.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. How are we doing? Does anyone have any burning questions so far, or just like completely lost? How are you doing, Flannery?
Yeah, doing well. I realized that I didn't have to type it in every single time, and you can click on the one in there. I was typing them out manually every time, so
You can.
to memory.
I wasn't going to be the one to say it because I'm going to encourage typing in the next bit. You'll see exactly how. But yes, you can also click the text in red on the right hand side, and it will copy it into the interactive bit on the left hand side.
Took me a while to figure that out. So.
I'll give it maybe, let's say another. Let's give it till 4 o'clock because we've got time. Maybe just type in the chat once you're finished, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we are at 4 o'clock, thereabouts. Whatever exercise you're on, let's just complete that one. How did folks find those introductory exercises?
Took me a while to get used to them personally, but some of the ones were easier than others, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also didn't realize that you could click on the red things. I was typing everything in.
That's good though, because I suppose it gets you used to the kind of patterns. It's a lot easier to get stuff wrong and then learn from your mistakes if you type it in wrong and figure out how things have changed. Asante or Princess Asante has said they liked it. It was interesting. Asante, you're going to have to let me know your name now. Is it Princess? I'm so intrigued. That's a really lovely name. I wish I was called Princess, to be honest. Cool, Princess. Well, it's really nice to meet you, Princess. And we did have a brief intro, which is why I'm not like picking on you. We had a brief intro before you started. But yeah, it's really nice to meet you. Great name. How did you find? Yeah, so you said you liked the exercises; they were interesting. Anything folks got really like stuck on, or just didn't click for you? Yeah.
So then I do understand most of the terms because I have experience with like other programming languages as well. I just haven't done Haskell before. So the thing I found a little confusing was the function declaration with the colon. I haven't seen that before. But
Yeah.
Everything else was familiar to me. So yeah.
Cool. That's really great. Thanks. Yeah, that's we actually used a combination of different of a couple of different concepts there. We used so that was like function definition, which differs depending on like whether you're doing it in the browser like this or in an interactive what's called a REPL, a read, evaluate, print loop. So the thing on the left is called a REPL. It's just like an interactive, you enter in some code and you get the result immediately back. And the way that you can define functions in the REPL is different to how you might define functions in a real life project. And we'll come to see that in the Haskell project when we work on that next. So it was a little bit confusing. Actually, I'm not very used to defining functions like that in the day-to-day either, combined with the colon thing that you mentioned, Princess, that was useful for pattern matching, which is another different concept. So that kind of combined the two things. And so I can certainly see that might have been quite a lot. So if folks are okay with it, we will move on to the Haskell project next, the rock, paper, scissors project. I'll reshare the main link in the chat just for repetition, completeness, I don't know, or just in case folks haven't seen it. So this is like the main page and the structure that we'll keep revisiting. We're now looking at the second link, which is the Haskell project rock, paper, scissors. So once you open that up, you should see a massive table of contents. You scroll past that, you'll see kind of an introduction to the project that we'll be working on today, which is a single player game of rock, paper, scissors. I'm not going to go through the rules of rock, paper, scissors because I've literally written them out there and hopefully folks might be familiar with it if not. And we will be doing this in an interactive, just like an online editor, so we don't have to download anything or set up a local development environment. This Haskell editor is called Wilde, and I'll encourage you to, I'll do a sort of a simple, an initial intro, and then I'll encourage us to kind of go through each step, as I mentioned before, kind of in our own time. Unmute yourself and ask questions or type questions in the chat as we go, or if anything's confusing or the wording's a little bit strange, please do feel free to mention that as well. There are no like stupid questions. If there's anything that's confusing, it's almost certainly the way that the guide has been written rather than your own misunderstanding. So with that, I'll give a an intro to the Code World editor. Now, as soon as you open this up, you see a really, oh, I've got a bit of an echo there. You see you should see a guide pop up, or you may see a guide pop up. If you do, just click away from it. This is the Hello World program, which is typically the first program that you might write in any language. You're printing text to a screen. And this is really just to walk us through what the Code World editor looks like. So our code editing space is on the left-hand side, and we'll be editing code here. Whenever we want to run our code to see what changes have been introduced, we can click run, and this may or may not change depending on what step we're on, and then we can share code. And I will encourage you to share code whenever you have any questions, or if you'd like to save your project separately. I'll encourage you to share code by copying and pasting this link into Zoom or into a notepad or whatever you have handy. And this is always really useful to help if we need help troubleshooting or debugging errors. I'll ask you to share your project code and we can go through it together. Finally, you can sign in with a Google account if you'd like to, but you don't have to. It's pretty limited to just Google accounts. If you don't have a Google account, it's not that helpful. If you would like to save your code, you can do so by copying and pasting this share link once you've done it, and you'll always have access to that. Towards the end as well, if folks have any questions about like committing their code to somewhere like GitHub to sort of store it somewhere else online, we can also discuss that and maybe go through an example of that. Otherwise, I'll let you go through this at your own pace. I'll go through it with you at my own pace, and mention any other things that I can think of as we go through. Fantastic. Any questions before we go ahead and get started? Awesome. Very last thing I will mention, actually, in case because it's not necessarily obvious, is that it's helpful to have your Code World editor open in one tab or one window, and then the project guide open in another, so that you can switch between the two easily. Very last thing, I will maybe give this like an hour for this particular project, and regardless of where you get to in the project, you'll have access to this guide for the duration, so you can always come back to it if we don't finish it today. do let me know if you have any questions so far. In the meantime, I'll take the time just to mention about this this particular kind of code view, which is where some of the code lines of the code are purple and other lines of the code are green. For those of you who are familiar with the likes of GitHub or any other kind of version control tool, this is like a diff view. So the lines in purple that begin with a negative symbol are the lines that indicating that you should remove that line or change that line. The lines in green that are prefixed with the plus symbol are lines that you would add. And sometimes even if there are minor changes, you might see them in the diff view as a single purple line and a single green line. And that's precisely so to limit copying and pasting, because it's actually easier to just to write it out in some cases. Otherwise, does anyone have any questions so far?
I've got a quick one. I've got a parse error in the pattern.
Okay. What function are you seeing a parse error for?
It was the line 8, so the minus main equals drawing of code world logo.
Okay, so it looks as though if I will just open up a new editor. So it sounds as though you've got a minus symbol in the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay. Code world logo. And we run that and we see parse error in pattern -main. So if we look back to this diff, this is actually not valid Haskell code. What this is doing is this is saying these are the changes that you would make to the previous version of the code. And so the lines that start with a minus are the lines that you would delete. The lines that start with a plus are the lines that you would add. And so this on its own isn't valid. But to resolve that, you would delete the symbol prefix.
I see. I wondered if that might be the minuses and the pluses we shouldn't actually be typing in right at the beginning.
Yeah. I've got completely unrelated errors there, so don't look at that. I'll just close that window slowly. Any other questions so far? How are we doing? Does anyone have any questions? I will just check in every like 10, 15 minutes or so, because I know, just in case anyone's question shy, I absolutely encourage you to ask any questions if you're stuck. Oh, I hope you don't mind, Flannery. Do you mind if I walk through this question you had in the chat out loud? I realise as well that probably the recording is going to look really strange because it's just all of us working in absolute silence. Flannery had a great question in the chat, which was that you're seeing an error that you're seeing this parse error specifically on line 17, and so we're doing a few things here. We have, so you've introduced a line that says type state equals text, right? Was that the most recent step that you've done?
I actually got past it because I was able to continue doing some of the other bits, but it still kept coming up with the same type error, so I had to come back to it.
Awesome. Okay. So let's take a look at the specific step that tells us to add randomness to our application. Well, first off, has anyone managed to complete this step? So we grab a random number and we change activity of to the initial function to accept a random number. Is anyone able to get to that part of the code yet and run it? Looking in chat as well. Okay, so this is an interesting one. What we have here, oh, cool. How is it? I'm sorry, I'm gonna mispronounce your name again. Gio Aquino.
Yeah.
Gio Aquino. Cool. Sorry, yeah. how it's spelled, right? So can you, between your code and Flannery's code, which is not this one, sorry, your code and Flannery's code, we can see the main function here. Do you notice any differences between what you've written, if it compiles, and this code?
I formatted the code in a slightly different way. I'm going to share it. Where was the chat? Here it is. I hope that you can receive it.
Yeah, this looks great. So I'll just copy, paste your project. Right, so
I'm fairly sure that there's some indentation issue as a first thing.
That's a great observation. So Flannery, do you notice there are two spaces after the do line? There are two spaces in between random, and then two spaces in between the beginning of activity of in this code.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, and that's because of something that isn't covered in the guide yet, but it's that Haskell has something called semantic white space. So indentation, spaces before lines, matter in this code, and they mean something. It means something very different if you have the main function as you've written it here, with versus the main function written in this way. Really annoying if that actually compiles. Joaquino, I am changing your code, but I'm not changing the version that you're seeing. Every time I compile something different,
no worries.
It changes the link. I was a bit annoyed that actually compiled. Anyway, so one important thing is that regardless of whether or not this specific program compiles, Haskell typically has something called semantic white space, which is that the indentation that you see here, maybe this is a better example, underneath the main function means that both the binding to random and the call of activity of comes within this do block here. And so all of this is should be in the same scope. So activity of should be run in the context of, in the scope of this do block. So the spacing is one thing. So I would say number one, try adding a couple of spaces before the line random and before the line activity of. There is a second thing as well. I've noticed in the code, and it's what's highlighted by the error message. It's the placement of your of your type definition. Now,
should it be toward the top, or?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I was going to say you could move it towards the top, but actually, and conventionally, you would use you would put type definitions towards the top of the code, but it actually shouldn't matter too much. The thing that does matter is that it's not in the middle of your main function. So your main function at the moment spans from this line to this line. And what I'm going to do, just to make that a little bit clearer, if you don't mind, is just add a little bit of white space in between your main function and the end of your main function. So this entire thing here is your main function. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if I put those space around the main function and then just keep that type function separate.
Yeah.
Before, it should be okay.
I would try doing two things. One, adding some spacing, and two, adding your type definition anywhere else outside of that main function.
Try that.
We may see some other errors here as well. That's not a problem. We can walk through them together if you'd like to.
Yes, I do have two other errors. Duplicate type signature for picture. Is that similarly an indentation issue?
This one is not an indentation issue. So what I'll ask you, maybe one question is, where do we define the picture type? Where is our type signature for picture? What line numbers?
It's later in the code, right? Line 22 on yours?
Yeah. Is that the only place?
Let's see, we've got it defined in line 13 and 14.
Okay, awesome. So with Haskell and with a lot of other kind of functional programming languages, they have a property called idempotency, which means that the values don't change once you've set them. And in some languages like JavaScript, for example, you might be able to say x equals 3, and then later on in your program, you might be able to say x equals 5, and the program is absolutely happy with that. In Haskell, unfortunately, you get the error message that is illustrated here, which is that you have multiple declarations of something. And that's because once you've set a value in Haskell, that doesn't change. It's what we call idempotent. So one thing here is that I can see you've got two definitions of picture. So one thing I would try is removing, it looks like maybe you have an older version and a slightly newer version, is that right?
Yeah, I think I didn't delete or I didn't remove the previous version.
Okay, so if should we try deleting lines 13 and 14 and seeing what happens?
Yeah.
But these are all really good questions, by the way, because
yeah, it worked out.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, that's perfect. Apologies for the 101 questions, but I appreciate the help.
No, it's great. I mean, that's what I'm here for, right? Otherwise, you might as well be, well, we all are sat in a room on our own, let's be honest with ourselves, even though we're on Zoom. But that's what I'm here for, right? I'm here to help answer questions. And if there's anything that I can clarify, don't hesitate to ask.
Great, thank you.
One thing I will say about this is keep an eye on the order of some of your definitions. So typically in a Haskell function, we'd have, for example, the type signature, for example, main, immediately above the function definition. So do you see how I've moved the type signature from the top of the file to immediately above the function definition?
Yeah, makes sense.
And that just means that if I'm coming in as a new developer, I can see that the type that main should have, and also its implementation. And I didn't actually realize that you could have the type signature so far from the definition, but apparently that's fine. The compiler doesn't seem to be complaining about that yet. If you have any other error messages, though, feel free, don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you so much, I appreciate it.
Gerald Kino has asked, does the declaration order matter in normal environments? I was about to say no, and I'm trying to think of I'm trying to think of a case where it might matter. No, I can't think of any. If you're talking about kind of function definition, like for example, if, let's think of an example. So we have starting message, for example. What I'm going to do here, just for your info as well, Flannery, is I'm going to pull the starting message just outside of the picture type signature and function definition. So I'm going to pull that out here. So we have our starting method. Starting message definition here, and we use it here. Again, to your question, Gio Aquino, sorry. The declaration order doesn't matter. So I could try running this. I haven't actually checked if it compiles now, but running source diff. Oh, that's okay, I think. Again, I'm changing your code, Flannery, but it's hopefully you shouldn't see it. It shouldn't be reflected in anything you're doing. Let's see if that compiles. Okay, I'm just going to do it in my. Okay, so if we have the starting message declaration on line 10, for example, and we refer to it in picture on line 28, it doesn't actually matter. The order doesn't matter if I move this to after its usage. It's perfectly valid code. And that's because of something called the scope. So once you've defined this starting message anywhere in the document, it's available. It has what's called global scope. So it's accessible from anywhere within this entire file. So I can access it from this line, or even within this nested if statement. Kind of discussing different scopes is a little bit outside of the scope of this workshop. But I'd be happy to chat about it a little bit more if we have questions at the end or later on. Did that answer your question? Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions or seeing any errors or warnings? We'll give it another 10 minutes and then we can maybe stop for questions and discussion. Just checking in again. How are we doing? Would anyone like a little bit more time to work on the project, or maybe the other way? If you're done and you would like to move on, just maybe mention it in the chat or something if you finished. Joe Aquino, I think I did see that your project was, you were pretty much there with your project, weren't you?
Yeah, that worked pretty much.
Awesome. How did you find it?
Unusual, very. I'm used to C basically, and just the function definition was completely different. And I was expecting something like a block of code for each statement, but apparently there's some pattern matching that does the job for us. And I'm wondering how does this scale for like big definition?
That's a great question. To be honest, you might see something. You might see maybe like, what's this? A 6-line pattern match. But I wouldn't say that this is particularly common in sort of production. What you might do here is define a. So we have, as you know, as I'm sure you've noticed, we have a bunch of repetition here, and we can factor out a few different things. We're doing a lot of string comparison here. So one thing we might do is introduce Haskell types that determine what input is valid. So we know that valid user input, at least for our purposes, are things like a key press of R, key press of P, or a key press of S. And we might encode that in a Haskell type. And then we can do the same here, and we can do a comparison between whatever representation we have of a move, which might be R, P, or S. Secondly, we might think about factoring some of this out so that we don't have to repeat ourselves with the game logic. So we might do something like, we might create a function that says, given 2 moves, any 2 moves, which we know to be valid things, because we've just, in our new example, we've defined some representation of a valid move. Given 2 moves, compare them and return the result. And what I might consider doing in a closer to production environment is giving these some value and then compare, like maybe a numeric value, and then comparing them and just determining a winner in fewer lines of code than we have here. So the answer to your question really is that this doesn't scale in the sense that you just write a 20-line pattern match, but this is an illustration of how you might do something like this, write a game simply using a pattern matching mechanism. Pattern matching in and of itself is quite common in Haskell. You can do more complex things with this, such as pattern matching on nested values. So here we're pattern matching on a nested value, which is something of a key press type, and we're pattern matching on the value of this key press type. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. If you like as well, we're quite comfortable for time, so we can discuss this more as well in the sort of questions and discussions afterwards. But in the meantime, if you're curious, I did actually do an implementation of I had the same thought that sometimes the pattern matching could be quite repetitive. If you're curious, you can take a look at the extension section at the bottom of resources. That gives an illustration of a way I might go about designing this, making better use of Haskell's type system. It's quite far out of the scope of what we wanted to touch on today, but you're more than welcome to take a look at it. And if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to discuss. Okay, we'll give 5 more minutes till 10 past 5 before we just move on to sort of discussion and general kind of project feedback. Does anyone have any questions in the meantime or stuck on anything in the meantime? Okay, so we're at 10 past 5. I would love to stop and just, maybe take some time for any questions, discussions, and a project sort of general review. What I would encourage you to do at this point is, if you have created an account or you've signed in, just to save your project or whatever progress you've made so far. If you haven't created an account, that's also fine. I would encourage you to do two things. Run your project just to confirm that you have the most recent compiled version of the code, and then click share, copy and paste your share link somewhere that you can revisit it. So that might be your notes application or somewhere else. If you would like to revisit your code, maybe you never want to see this again. Who knows? But you have both the, maybe if you would like as well, feel free to copy the project guide link in case you'd like to finish anything off in your own time as well. Awesome. So I wanted to get an impression from folks. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen as well, because I'm not doing anything on it. How did folks find the project in general? Maybe just get some initial impressions.
I think it took some time getting used to the system, but once you started to figure out the rules, then it starts to make more sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, same with me. It was not what I'm used to really, but sort of once I got used to it and how to write things and not put the negative and the plus and stuff in, yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it.
That's really good feedback. I'll bear that in mind as well about the negative and plus symbols that you mentioned were like a different view that I'm trying out. So I'll take the feedback on board as to whether.
I think it was probably pretty clear, to be honest. It just took me a little while to realise.
Honestly, like I say, if there's anything that's confusing or like unintuitive, it's usually, there's always ways that it can be improved in the guide as well. So it's never a silly question. Is there anything that caught folks out as particularly sort of unintuitive or like, oh, I've never seen that before?
For me, the spacing, but that's probably just because I'm not used to coding.
That's cool. Yeah, I realized as well actually that semantic white space, that mention of the indentation wasn't ever explicit in the guide as well. So I'm really glad you asked the question, because it gave an opportunity to illustrate it and also to highlight the kind of error that you might see in a production environment if that same thing happens again, or in another project. Anything else that was kind of unintuitive or very surprising? I'm going to pick on people now. Lace, how did you find the project?
It's very different than the things I used to code. So like using the arrow to declare that is a double and the state is very different from what I am used to. But I think when you start to understand the language, it's easy and it's very intuitive how you describe things. So yeah.
Cool. I'm glad you think so. I think one of the things that I really love about Haskell is when we talk about kind of functional programming languages, there are different languages on a very, very broad spectrum of like this language has like functional programming aspects versus like a very functional programming language. And what I mean by that is that with Haskell in particular, there are a lot of things that boil down to a really nice simplicity, in that things can really can be expressed as though they were mathematical functions. Like a lot of things do boil down to, this is an expression, and expressions can be composed, expressions can be passed as values to other expressions, and there's a really nice simplicity in that I like. But it does take some getting used to. It certainly had a very steep learning curve for me. Princess, what were your thoughts on the project? How did you find it? Maybe they've gone for a cup of tea. Okay, are there any, I'm going to maybe ask a few questions as well, just almost like a bit of a pop quiz, and maybe we can have some discussion. Princess, is not a problem. I've just seen your message in chat that you're having issues with your mic. It's no problem. If you would like to mention anything, please feel free to type it in chat, and I'll try to include it in the conversation as well. So no problem there. And same goes to everyone. If you'd rather not speak on the mic, or if you're having any issues, feel free to just type your thoughts in chat, and I'll try to read them out for hopefully maybe the purposes of the recording as well. So one of the questions I kind of touched on briefly actually was, what does it mean for functions to be first class? It was touched on very, very briefly in the guide, but I wanted to discuss or see if anyone spotted it. Or maybe we could even step back one and talk about the idea of a function itself. What do people, like after this project and after the exercises that we've done in the Try Haskell tutorial, how would you describe a function?
I'd say it's something that's going to take a value that is input and give you an output value. Pretty basic.
That's a really simple, really nice description. Yeah, you might say it takes inputs and returns an output. You might say it's a relation between inputs and outputs. So it describes what should happen to the inputs in order to get the outputs as well. Princess has said it's a container of code. I like the kind of idea that you almost have like a block that's a function, and it contains the code, and that suggestion, Princess, makes me think of the notion of like scope, which I very, very briefly discussed with Gio Aquino. But the idea that what I mean by scope is that variables that you define in your function, or values that you define in your function, are only accessible from within that function. So from the first line where you define maybe not x maybe x is a good example, initial equals blah 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 blah, everything after the equal sign until the end of that function definition is within the scope of the function. And so if you define a new value or a new variable within that function, then it's contained in that scope. So I like that suggestion, Princess, that it's a kind of container of code, because for new variables defined in the function, it is contained in the scope of that function. So that's a great suggestion. In this particular example, we're describing an activity. We have an initial state for this activity. Can anyone suggest one of the two other parts of an activity that we need to in order to have a fully functioning activity? It's not initial.
Change.
Yeah. So we have a function that takes some state and some event. So that might be a mouse click, that might be a hover, or time passing, or anything else. It takes a state and then an event, and then returns a new version of the state that's responded in some way to that event. So in this particular program, we decided that the event that we cared about was a key press, and it was a key press of 3 specific letters. And we decided that the change that we wanted to make to the state would be to change the text that's rendered on the canvas. Can anyone say what the purpose of the initial state is, or in this context?
It is to take the random value for the computer, so we can play against it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in the context of this project, we generate a random move for the computer, and that's just so we have some initial state to work with. But actually, more generally, what you might find, any of you who might be familiar with other programming languages already, or other production systems, is that actually this whole idea of taking some state, having some notion of what should happen in response to some events, and also how the state should be rendered on the page, for example, on a website, or in this particular application on the canvas. These three kind of state management components are very common in a lot of functional systems. So for example, websites, you might have the state of your application, the state of your website, which is, I don't know, the user's profile, and the response to the events that you might receive to that user profile might be key presses. So they might be changes in the user's profile information, for example. And once the user presses submit, the state change might be that the user's profile is re-rendered onto the page. So maybe if you've uploaded a profile photo, that profile photo is returned to you and rendered on the page. So this is a really common kind of design pattern for functional applications. So it's really, really worth just kind of, I suppose, playing about with. Are there any other sort of questions or things that came up to you as curious, or that you'd like to understand more about? Joaquina, I'm really curious. Did you check out the version that used the state types?
Yeah, I saw that. It's much more complicated.
It's much more complicated. Yeah, so I'll share with you. What we're speaking about. So I mentioned to Joaquino that once we've had a look at this project, actually maybe that's one discussion I think we haven't had yet, is can anyone point out ways that we might improve this system? So I'll share with you this. This is a kind of completed version. Yes, I think this is a completed version of the project. I'll share in chat so you can all check it out. This is one way of writing the code. So there's no obviously this is, there are guided steps for this particular project, but if your functions are in a different order or if things are slightly different, that's absolutely fine. This is the version that I made as I went through this guide with you. Knowing what you do about your experience of building this project, and also looking at this version of the completed project, can you think of any suggestions that we might make to it? Improvements that we might make to it?
So could you maybe see the rows 26 to 28?
Yeah.
Could they maybe be somehow concatenated into one row so that you're not repeating?
Yeah.
Like the same thing.
Yeah.
Just with making the statement on the left like a list almost, of the different input options. Yeah,
absolutely. So you could do something like, I don't know, this is pseudocode, so this may not run, but this double dash is a code comment. So maybe you could do something like, instead of having those 3 lines above, you could have picture state, and then you would have to perhaps do this in the function body. So on a new line, you might have something like if so we're having a list of, I'm creating a list here of the valid moves. Includes the way that we might actually write this is using a function lm, so short for element. So if I can't remember the order of arguments here, but if the state value is included in this list of valid moves, that we've got here, then return lettering, starting message, and so on. I can't type and talk at the same time, evidently, but you see what I mean. And then you've got, and then you can do an else statement here for other else lettering state. So something like this.
Yeah, and then is there a way to sort of to throw out like a debug message? Like I tested it and hit like A on my keyboard, knowing it would do nothing. But is there, you know, could you shoot out a message that says like have another thing, not starting message, but like another message?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that will shoot out, you know, like not valid, blah blah blah, or something.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, and that's actually something that we would probably handle better in production code.
Yeah. Okay.
Where there are a couple of places that we could handle this. Where would you, if you were improving this, where might you start adding this logic to check what value the key press is?
So, oh, sorry, I just meant for a message to output. If so you've got there if it's RP or S, if it's one of those elements, then to shoot out the starting message, but to have like a not valid message or something like that was what I meant. Sorry, but yeah, I suppose to define only valid elements.
Yeah, that's a really great. Yes, so the answer to that question is you can certainly update this picture function to change based on the value of state. So where the state is RP or S or another text. What I would actually, the way I might think about this in a production system is actually say that the state type should always be valid.
Yeah.
Because whenever we define like types in a typed functional programming language like Haskell, we always want to have some level of like what's the word I'm looking for? Like trust in our types. So if we say here that actually state could be completely invalid, I would kind of want to handle that earlier before making it the state, before that's not very well, before allowing it to become a valid state, if that makes sense. So I would probably want to handle that in the change function and have some kind of handling mechanism that checks whether or not the key press is a valid move before we even get to the point where we're rendering it on the canvas. Awesome. Last thing I will ask, and we've got a couple of minutes, so we can I'll give you at least a minute back. Did folks enjoy the project? Was it a drag? Suppose maybe it.
Yeah, personally I enjoyed it, but again, I'm a fairly new to coding, so it's pretty exciting to have it turn into something that actually works.
Awesome, that's really good to hear.
Yeah, it's good to get like an output and watch it actually run through.
Awesome. And maybe general, Karen said it was good once you got your head around it. Yeah, absolutely. You and me both. I certainly found myself when I first learned Haskell, like hitting my head against a lot of these kind of quite cryptic error messages and trying to figure out what types should go where. And so I can certainly appreciate that it takes a little while to figure out. But from experience, it's certainly worth continuing to have a go at if you're interested. I hope this has been a good first impression for you. Yeah, thank you so much for coming along to the workshop. Yeah, and thanks. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons and evenings.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.